This video was brought to you by Brilliant. On Friday, 4 Tajik Islamists carried out a mass shooting in Moscow, apparently on behalf of ISIS. While most of the international media has since focused on how this might affect Ukraine, within Russia, nationalist commentators have already started blaming Putin's conspicuously liberal immigration policies, which have always been controversial within Russia. So in this video, we're going to explain Putin's surprisingly liberal immigration policies, why they've always been controversial, and why, in this light, Friday's attack is so politically dangerous for him. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start with a bit of context. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, there were massive migrant flows both in and out of Russia. In 1991, for instance, an astonishing 4 million people immigrated into Russia, and a similar number emigrated. At the time, the immigrants were mainly Russians in other parts of the USSR returning home, while the emigrants were mostly ethnic minorities from other former Soviet states returning to their home countries. While some, about 30% of these immigrants, were actually non-Russians coming from other parts of the former Soviet Union, mostly from Central Asia. These immigrants were mostly trying to flee the political turmoil that accompanied the Soviet Union's demise, but Russia was actually very happy to let them in part because there was a sense in the Russian political class that former Soviet citizens should be allowed to choose which country they ended up in, and because the number of Central Asian migrants wasn't large enough to be politically controversial. In the mid-2000s, however, the number of Central Asian migrants coming into the country significantly increased, with net migration rising from about 40,000 in 2003 to about 240,000 in 2007. This was largely because of the revival of the Russian economy, which had been in a deep recession for the most of the 90s. However, in the 2000s, the Russian economy enjoyed some pretty rapid growth, with GDP at an average rate of about 7%, largely thanks to exponential rises in oil prices. Now, since then, the Russian government has implemented a whole load of migrant-related laws, but these have been more about regulating and legalizing what used to be undocumented migrant flows, rather than restricting them. The number of Central Asian migrants coming into Russia has therefore remained relatively steady, and Putin has actually liberalized Russia's immigration laws in the past few years. In 2014, Russia created the Eurasian Economic Union, which allowed freedom of movement between Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia, which was then expanded to include Armenia and Kyrgyzstan a year later. Then, in April 2020, Putin signed a law allowing dual Russian citizenship for foreigners, which basically means that you don't have to renounce your previous citizenship before applying to citizenship in Russia. This policy has been particularly popular with migrants from Tajikistan, which is the poorest country in Central Asia. In 2022, nearly 200,000 Tajiks acquired Russian citizenship, far more than any other country and nearly 2% of Tajikistan's entire population. Anyway, official data on the number of migrants currently living in Russia varies wildly. But the headline here is that today there are millions of migrants living in Russia, and Russia probably has one of the largest migrant populations in the world. This relatively liberal immigration policy has always been controversial inside of Russia, though. In 2017, in a rare show of public discontent, a communist MP complained that Russia is flooded with poorly qualified immigrant laborers who are stealing jobs from ordinary Russians. This sentiment is apparently shared by most of the Russian public, and Levada polling suggests that something like 70% of Russians want more restrictive immigration policy. Russian nationalists, including Alexei Navalny, have also attacked him on this issue. While he's today known as a Russian liberal, Navalny began his political career as a relatively hardline Russian nationalist, and in the early 2000s, Navalny recorded a video where, dressed as a dentist, he compared immigrants to a decaying tooth that needs to be ripped out. But while Putin occasionally paid lip service to nationalist concerns, admitting in 2017 that Central Asian immigration was causing, quote, irritation among the local population, he refused to significantly restrict immigration, and once declared that the popular nationalist slogan, Russia for Russians, was for, quote, fools and provocateurs. In fact, only a year ago, the Kremlin said it anticipated net migration of about 400,000 people annually for the foreseeable future. So why has Putin pursued this relatively liberal immigration policy, even if it's been so politically controversial? Well, as we see it, there are two main reasons. The first is that it's a good way of keeping the former Soviet countries, especially those in Central Asia, within Russia's political orbit. The second is that migration is the only way to offset Russia's demographic decline. Like many developed countries, Russia has a fertility rate below the replacement rate of 2.1 at about 1.5, which means that its population is shrinking and aging. However, this figure disguises the magnitude of Russia's demographic crisis for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this data is from 2020, so it doesn't account for the effect of the war in Ukraine. But secondly, Russia suffered a crippling demographic shock in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's because the fertility rate dropped from 2.1 to 1.4, and the male mortality rate basically doubled, with life expectancy also falling by about 5 years. That means that Russia's population pyramid now looks something like this. And that inward slump reflects the fact that because fewer people were born in the 90s, today Russia has very few 20 and 30-year-olds, which means that Russia won't be having too many babies this generation. Putin himself is acutely aware of Russia's demographic issues. In a now infamous article published shortly before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin vexed about the possibility of a Russian population decreasing by hundreds of thousands or even millions. Unfortunately for Putin, though, many in Russia, especially Russian nationalists, have already blamed last week's terror attack on these liberal immigration policies. This is particularly dangerous for Putin because his immigration policy is genuinely unpopular with most Russians, but there's no easy solution here. The obvious thing to do would be to just announce tighter migration controls, but the Russian economy can't afford a structural reduction in migration numbers. This is essentially because the government is spending loads of money to fund their war in Ukraine, but this cash injection into the Russian economy has pushed up inflation, which has been running at about 7% for the last few months. Given that unemployment is already running at a record low, reducing migration would probably result in labor shortages, which would mean higher wages and therefore probably even higher levels of inflation. Now, this could be tamed with further interest rate hikes from the Russian central bank, but rates are already at 16%, and further hikes would almost definitely induce a recession. In short, it looks like Putin is stuck in a trilemma. He can't fund the war in Ukraine without either dangerously high levels of inflation or an interest rate-induced recession, leaving him with little political space to alleviate public upset about his migration policy. Now, understanding what exactly is going to happen here is a little tricky, requiring you to evaluate a lot of different information from often partial sources. It'll be sensible then to begin improving your own critical thinking skills so that you can stay sharp and better understand what's going on. And, well, our sponsor, Brilliant.org, can help you do exactly that. Brilliant is the online learning platform that's designed specifically to teach you everything from maths, data analysis, programming, and AI from the ground up. You don't need a fancy degree or to have dedicated hundreds of hours to studying any of these topics. All you need is a device with an internet connection and a spare few minutes a day. And with those few minutes, you'll be learning by actually doing. Because Brilliant allows you hands-on lessons that allow you to play around with concepts. A method that has been shown to be 6 times more effective than just watching lectures. What makes this even better is that this content is created by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, and more. You can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the link in the description. That way, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.